It shows up in the same places, generation after generation. The western parishes of Kerry, the fishing villages of Galway, the cliff-edge communities of Cork and Clare. A face so internally consistent, so geographically predictable, that researchers began calling it one of the most unusual pigmentation puzzles in all of European genetics. Black hair, often thick and resistant to the kind of color variation that appears elsewhere on the island. Skin pale enough to draw contrast, eyes ranging from gray to green to a particular shade of blue, that carries something almost northern in it. And the whole combination sitting in a population that, by every expectation, should produce something very different. For a long time, nobody had the tools to answer what was actually producing it. So they did what humans always do when the evidence runs out. They told stories. Some of those stories were dramatic. Some were plausible enough to survive for centuries. And every single one of them turned out to be pointing in exactly the wrong direction. Not partially wrong, fundamentally wrong. Wrong about the time frame, wrong about the mechanism, wrong about the origin point. What the science eventually uncovered was something that none of the popular theories had ever considered, because the real answer required going backward in time so far that the concept of Ireland as a name place hadn't yet existed. The dominant explanation, the one still repeated in Irish-American communities, in pubs along the west coast, in family lore passed down across generations, places the origin in 1588. The Spanish Armada, launched by Philip II of Spain to invade England, was catastrophically destroyed. Not primarily by English naval power, but by a series of violent Atlantic storms that tore the fleet apart and drove the wreckage onto the coastlines of Scotland and Ireland. Ships went down off Sligo, off Clare, off the Kerry. Headlands. Survivors swam ashore. They were dark. They were foreign. And the story writes itself from there. They settled. They stayed. Their children carried the darkness of southern Europe into isolated Irish communities, and the face that resulted persisted across generations, because those communities stayed closed and inward-facing enough to preserve it. But here is what undermines the theory entirely. The Scandinavian genetic signal is concentrated in the east of Ireland, in the cities and coastal settlements the Vikings built and occupied. The face researchers are trying to explain is concentrated in the west. Kerry and Galway and Cork are not where the Vikings settled in any meaningful numbers. They are precisely where the Viking genetic signal is weakest. Any theory pointing toward Norse ancestry as the origin of a Western Irish trait is pointing in exactly the opposite geographic direction from where the trait actually appears. That is not a theory with a small problem. That is a theory that has failed its most basic geographic test. To find the actual answer, you have to leave the medieval world entirely, not by a century, not by 5 centuries, but by something closer to 4,000 years. Because what the genomic evidence now shows is that the explanation for the Black Irish face has nothing to do with any historically documented arrival on Irish soil. It predates documentation entirely. It predates the Irish language. It predates the mythological cycles that gave Ireland its earliest sense of its own identity. It goes back to a demographic event so complete, so geographically sweeping, that it effectively remade the human population of the British Isles within a few centuries. And the Western Irish communities have been sitting on top of what survived that transformation ever since. Around 2500 BCE, Ireland was not empty. It was home to a well-established population of farming communities whose ancestors had migrated northward from the Mediterranean region thousands of years earlier. These were the people who built the megalithic monuments that still stand across the Irish landscape today. Newgrange in County Meath, completed around 3200 BCE, predates the Egyptian pyramids and required the organized labor of a society with sophisticated planning capacity, generational memory, and continuous cultural investment. The people who built it had been on the island long enough to develop a fully distinct cultural identity. They farmed, they kept cattle, they buried their dead in ways that reflected complex beliefs about the relationship between the living and the dead, and genetically, they carried a specific pigmentation profile rooted in their southern European ancestry, one that included the alleles responsible for darker hair coloration that their Mediterranean forebears had carried for tens of thousands of years. Then something arrived that the genomic record describes with unusual clarity. The culture archaeologists call the Bell Beaker people, named for the inverted bell shape of their distinctive pottery, began moving across continental Europe in a migration that eventually reached Britain and Ireland from around 2500 BCE onward. They brought metallurgy, specifically early bronze working, that gave them tools and weapons the existing population could not match. They brought new burial practices. They brought domesticated horses. And they brought, encoded in their biology, a genetic profile that was fundamentally different from the farming population already living on the island. What followed was not gradual cultural blending. Ancient DNA evidence published in a landmark 2018 study in the journal Nature, drawing on genomic analysis of over 400 ancient individuals across Europe, showed that the Bell Beaker migration into Britain and Ireland was accompanied by a population replacement so thorough it has almost no parallel anywhere else in European prehistory. Within a few centuries of the Beaker arrival, the genetic ancestry of the British Isles shifted dramatically. The Neolithic farmer ancestry that had dominated the population for thousands of years was largely displaced. Researchers estimated that in Britain, ancient farmer ancestry dropped to around 10% of the total gene pool. Ireland shows a similar, though somewhat less complete, transformation, with Neolithic farmer ancestry surviving at higher levels in certain regions, particularly in the West, than anywhere else in the British Isles. The mechanism behind this replacement is still debated among archaeologists and geneticists. Some researchers point to violence and direct displacement. Others suggest that differential reproductive success, driven by the technological advantages the Beaker people carried, allowed them to outcompete the existing population over many generations without requiring systematic conflict. The genomic data cannot resolve that question definitively. What it can confirm is the outcome. The Ireland that existed before the Beaker arrival was demographically transformed at a scale that reshaped the entire genetic foundation of the population. But here's where the story becomes significantly more complicated than a simple replacement narrative. On Rathlin Island off the northern Irish coast, researchers from Trinity College Dublin excavated the skeletal remains of Bronze Age men buried between approximately 2500 and 2000 BCE. When the ancient DNA from those remains was sequenced and analyzed, the men carried a specific paternal lineage marker designated R1b-L21. That same marker, in a direct, unbroken line of paternal descent, is found today in over 65% of Irish men. Those Bronze Age individuals were not distant genetic relatives of the modern Irish population. They were, in the most literal biological sense, their direct ancestors. The Irish of today are substantially the Irish of the Bronze Age. What happened 4,000 years ago is still sitting in the cells of living people. The Bell Beaker migrants also introduced genetic variants that spread rapidly through the expanding population. One of the most consequential was the mutation for lactase persistence, the biological ability to continue digesting milk sugar into adulthood. In most mammals, including most human populations globally, the gene responsible for producing lactase switches off after early childhood. The Beaker-associated genetic architecture that shifted pigmentation tendencies toward lighter hair and lighter eyes as it spread through the founding population. But not everything was replaced. The Neolithic farmer ancestry did not vanish. It survived within the new demographic structure at varying levels across different regions of the island. And the pigmentation alleles that farming population carried, the ones encoding darker hair, did not disappear from the gene pool. It persisted within lineages that maintained enough of the ancient farmer ancestry to keep expressing them across subsequent generations. A 2017 study published in Scientific Reports, led by researchers from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland and Trinity College Dublin, analyzed individuals whose grandparents all originated from specific Irish regions and identified 10 genetically distinct population clusters across the island. The most ancient clusters, carrying the strongest signal of pre-Bronze Age ancestry, were concentrated in the western counties. Kerry and Cork showed greater genetic continuity with Bronze Age Ireland than any other sampled region on the island. The Y-chromosome tells the story of fathers. It passes from father to son without mixing with the maternal contribution, which makes it an extraordinarily clean record of male migration events, conquests, and population movements across time. The paternal story of Ireland, as the ancient DNA evidence shows, is largely a story of transformation. The Bell Beaker arrival reshaped the male lineages of the island with a thoroughness that left the Bronze Age founding population as the dominant paternal signal in the modern Irish genome. But the maternal record, preserved in mitochondrial DNA, which passes exclusively from mother to child and never mixes with the paternal contribution, tells a story of remarkable and largely uninterrupted continuity that reaches back far beyond the Bronze Age entirely. Mitochondrial DNA analysis of the modern Irish population, drawing on data compiled across multiple large-scale European genomic studies, including work published through the NCBI and referenced in population genetics research from University College Dublin, reveals that the most common maternal lineage in Ireland today is haplogroup H. This lineage traces through early European farmers and Bronze Age migrants and has been present on the island in various subcategories for thousands of years. But sitting alongside that dominant signal are older lineages that were never displaced. A significant minority of Irish women carry haplogroup U, one of the most ancient maternal genetic signatures in Europe. A specific branch, designated U5, connects living Irish women directly to the Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who first populated the island after the last ice age ended more than 7,000 years ago. These were people living along the Irish coastline before farming arrived, before monuments were built, before any of the cultural transformations that defined the subsequent millennia had begun. Their mitochondrial DNA did not disappear. It is still present in the living population, passed through an unbroken line of mothers across 7,000 years of Irish history. This matters directly for understanding the Black Irish because many of these ancient maternal lineages, when mapped against modern reference populations using techniques developed through projects like the 1000 Genomes Initiative, show their closest genetic matches not to Britain or Scandinavia, but to France, to northern Iberia, to the broader Atlantic coastal zone that stretches from Portugal to Scotland along the western edge of Europe. These are not the signatures of medieval arrivals. They are the genetic echoes of ancient maritime connections, seafaring communities that moved along the Atlantic coastline thousands of years before any historically documented migration event, carrying family groups, cultural practices, and crucially, specific pigmentation genetics into the Irish population from a direction and at a timescale that no story about Spanish sailors or Norse raiders ever approached. The picture that emerges when the paternal and maternal records are read together is one of complementary forces operating across the same population simultaneously. The paternal line brought demographic transformation. The maternal line preserved what existed before that, transformation, and wove it into the genetic fabric of the new population structure. Ireland's fathers reshaped the island's genetic foundation around 2500 BCE. Ireland's mothers preserved something older within that new foundation and passed it forward across every subsequent generation. The result is a population carrying a genuine internal range of genetic expression, from the red hair and freckling driven by MC1R variants introduced and amplified through the Bronze Age founding population, to the dark hair and pale skin driven by Neolithic farmer pigmentation alleles that survived within the maternal and mixed ancestry lines that never fully disappeared. The biological mechanism that makes this visible sits in a gene called MC1R, the master regulator of human pigmentation. Ireland's relationship with this gene is unlike that of any other population on Earth. Specific loss-of-function variants of MC1R are responsible for red hair, and Ireland carries those variants at a global frequency record. Roughly 10% of the Irish population has naturally red hair, against a global average below 2%. But carrying an MC1R variant does not automatically produce red hair. Pigmentation is a competitive system, not a simple switch. MC1R variants weaken the melanin production signal. Separate melanin pathway genes strengthen it. The visible outcome in any individual depends on which system is dominant in their particular genetic configuration. Someone can carry a red hair variant and still express jet black hair if their melanin production genes are strong enough to override the MC1R signal entirely. This happens consistently across Irish families. Two siblings born to the same parents can carry the same underlying MC1R variant and express hair colors on opposite ends of the spectrum. The same genetic contest, played out across thousands of individual configurations, produces the full range of Irish appearance within a single coherent population. Ancient DNA analysis confirms that the dark pigmentation alleles driving those darker outcomes were present in Ireland during the Neolithics period, carried by the Mediterranean-descended farmers whose communities dominated the island before the Bronze Age transformation. Those alleles entered the Bronze Age population through the maternal lines and mixed ancestry that survived the demographic shift. They then competed across subsequent generations with the lighter pigmentation genetics introduced through the Beaker founding population, and they never lost that competition entirely. They held on with enough frequency and enough geographic concentration to keep producing recognizable combinations in consistent communities across 4,000 years. The geographic concentration of that consistency is not accidental. It is the direct and measurable result of isolation operating on a specific gene pool across an extended and largely uninterrupted period of time, and the story of how that isolation worked is, in its own way, as remarkable as the genetics it preserved. The Western coastline of Ireland was never the destination that outsiders chose when they had other options. The land is difficult. The weather is relentless. The Atlantic delivers its full force to those cliffs without interruption, and the thin, rocky soils of Connaught and Munster reward only the communities that have spent enough generations learning how to work within their particular constraints. Vikings building trading cities chose the sheltered eastern harbors. Norman lords consolidating power after the 12th century invasion moved into the fertile Midlands and the productive eastern corridor where agriculture and taxation made administrative sense. The Ulster plantation of the 17th century reshaped the north. Wave after wave of outside influence touched the western coastline last, least, and emmost superficially of all. The Irish DNA Atlas Project, published in Scientific Reports in 2017 by researchers from the Royal College of Surgeons in Ireland and Trinity College Dublin, made this geography visible in genetic data for the first time at a population-wide SCALE. The study analyzed individuals whose grandparents all originated from specific Irish counties, creating a genetic snapshot of Ional Irish ancestry before recent urbanization blurred the older boundaries. What emerged was not a single uniform Irish population, BTT 10 genetically distinct regional clusters. The western clusters, centered on Kerry, Cork, Galway, and the surrounding counties, show the strongest signal of ancient Irish ancestry, the deepest continuity with Bronze Age genomic profiles, and the weakest signal of Tihi Norwegian-like ancestry component that the Viking period had introduced into the eastern and northern populations. Later arrivals had left their marks across much of the island. In the west, those marks were barely visible. The communities there had come through 1,000 years of documented Irish history and emerged genetically closer to their Bronze Age ancestors than to their own geographic nodes. HBOR's 2 counties to the east. When a population remains isolated from outside genetic influence across enough generations, something specific and measurable happens to rare traits. They do not simply survive at the frequency they entered isolation with. Through the MVs, mechanism geneticists call the founder effect, combined with the ordinary drift of allele frequencies across small closed populations, unusual trait combinations can become progressively more concentrated until they shift from rare to characteristic. The pigmentation, ollie. Leila is encoding dark hair alongside the pale skin that the Atlantic climate, selected for over millennia, had exactly the conditions the Y needed in the Western Irish communities to make that shift. What began as a surviving minority signal from the Neolithic farmer ants. Stry became, across enough generations of internal marriage and geographic containment, a stable and recurring feature of entire communities. Families recognized it, communities carried it, and the cultural patterns that surrounded those communities reinforced what geography had started. The Great Famine of 1845 to 1852 added a final and devastating layer to this story. When the population of Ireland collapsed from approximately 8 million people to around 4 million within less than a decade, through starvation and mass migration, the genetic consequences were not uniform across the island. The western counties, already the most isolated and the most internally cohesive, came through the famine with their community structures more intact than the regions that experienced the most catastrophic depopulation. The people who remained were disproportionately the descendants of the most deeply rooted western community. High ties. The ancient genetic signal, already concentrated by centuries of geographic and cultural isolation, became more concentrated till as the population contracted around the communities that had always carried it most strongly. There is one additional genetic marker that confirms this entire picture from a completely independent angle. A variant affecting iron metabolism, associated with the condition hereditary hemochromatosis, appears at its highest recorded frequency anywhere in the world, in the western counties of Ireland. In modern medical contexts, this variant causes the body to absorb excess iron from food, which, without management, leads to serious organ damage over time. But in historical contexts of chronic nutritional scarcity across the repeat, subsistence crises that defined life in the Irish West across many centuries, a tendency toward increased iron absorption likely provided a genuine survival advantage to carriers. The fact that this variant is most concentrated in exactly the same Western community, where the Black Irish appearance is most consistently found, is not geographic coincidence. It reflects the same underlying biologue I call reality. These communities are the genetic descendants of a specific ancestral population that survived specific historical pressure, across a very long period of time. The hemochromatosis variant and the dark pigmentation alleles are both signatures of the same deep ancestry, concentrated in the same people, by the same forces of isolation, selective survival, and continuity operating across millennia rather than centuries. What the full body of genomic evidence describes, drawn together from ancient DNA excavations, motor end population sampling, mitochondrial lineage analysis, Y-chromosome mapping, autosomal ancestry modeling, and regional genetic clues. Tearing studies is a population that experienced one major demographic transformation approximately 4,000 years ago, and then was left substantially alone to develop within that foundation. 3 ancestral streams contributed to what became the modern Irish genome. Western hunter-gatherers who repopulated the island after the last ice age provided the oldest layer. Neolithic farmers whose ancestors came from the Mediterranean provided the pigmentation genetics that never disappeared. Bronze Age Bell Beaker migrants Prove, dead the founding paternal structure that still dominates Irish male lineages today. Those three streams have remained in essentially St. Abel proportion for nearly 4,000 years in the Western communities, a degree of genetic continuity that has almost no parallel elsewhere in Western Europe. When consumer genomic testing became widely available and people of Irish descent began mapping their own ancestry against ancient DNA reference panels, something quietly confirmatory emerged from the aggregate data. Individuals identifying as Black Irish or coming from family backgrounds associated with that appearance consistently showed elevated levels of the European farmer ancestry component compared to the Irish average. That component traces directly to the Neolithic population, whose descendants were the dominant inhabitants of Ireland before the Bell Beaker transformation. Their pigmentation genetics survived in the new demographic structure that transformation created. The test results simply made visible what the population genetics research had already established at the scientific level. The Irish diaspora confirmed it from yet another direction. When millions of Irish people immigrated to the United States, Canada, and Australia across the 19th century, the full spectrum of Irish genetic express scion traveled with them. The Black Irish face appeared in Boston and New York and Chicago, in the same communities as red hair and freckles because it had always been part of the same population. It was never a separate genetic category that had arrived through a separate channel. It was always the ancient end of an internal range. The visible expression of Neolithic pigmentation alleles that survived 4,000 years of demographic change, geographic isolation, cultural continuity, and historical pressure, and had come through all of it, still expressing themselves in the faces of people who carried them. The face on the western cliffs of Ireland, not a mystery imported from somewhere else. It is not a shipwreck. It is not a raid. It is not a conquest. It is the oldest face on the island, looking out at the same Atlantic horizon its ancestors have been looking at for 4,000 years, carrying in its biology a record of survival so long and so continuous that every romantic story invented to explain it away looks exactly like what the host stories always were. Recent, shallow, unnecessary. The science did not solve a mystery. It revealed that there was never a missed area at all, only an answer so old that nobody thought to look for it there.